Have you
Go
ever
back
trusted
in right
someone
now,
so
you
much,
insolent girl.
only
Oh,
to discover they were
heavens,
hurting the ones you
please
loved
calm down.
most?
You are
This
frightening the
billionaire thought he
staff.
had everything: a perfect home, a charming fiancée, and two beautiful children. But when laughter in his mansion turned to silence, he did something unthinkable. He went undercover as a gardener to uncover the truth hidden behind those walls. Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me, from which country and at what time are you watching this story? When the autumn wind swept through the Whitfield estate, the roses that once bloomed with laughter now stood silent, much like the man who owned them. The sun had only begun to rise above the misty ridge, yet the garden was already awake with a faint rustle of leaves. From his study window, Graham Whitfield watched the morning light fall across the stone path he used to walk with his late wife. He had built this house for her, for their children, for the life that was supposed to last. Now it was a quiet museum of memories and expensive regrets. The faint aroma of coffee drifted from the kitchen, but no one was laughing. No one was singing along to the radio the way they once did. Downstairs, his new wife, Claudia Rivers, was already directing the morning routine like a general on parade. "Hazel, sit up straight," she called out, her tone clipped. "Noah, don't touch that glass. You'll spill it." The little boy froze, his chubby hands hovering midair. Graham could hear it all from the hallway, the sighs, the small tremors in his daughter's voice as she whispered, "Sorry, ma'am." He stepped into the dining room. The silver cutlery gleamed beneath the chandelier, the kind of perfection Claudia adored. "Good morning," he said softly. Claudia looked up only long enough to smile with her lips, not her eyes. "Morning, darling. The children are still learning manners." Hazel, barely 6, stared down at her plate, the crust of toast untouched. Noah rubbed his eyes, fighting back tears. Graham sat down, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "They're children, Claudia. Let them be." She straightened her blouse and said, "They'll thank me someday." Her words clinked in the air like cold glass. Silence swallowed the table. Outside, a bird chirped, unaware of the quiet war brewing between the walls. After breakfast, Graham walked out to the garden. The air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. Leaves rustled underfoot as he passed the rose bushes, most of them untrimmed since spring. His late wife had loved them, said they made the house feel alive. Now, the petals drooped, colorless and tired, as if they too mourned her absence. He crouched to touch one stem, and a thorn pricked his finger. The sting felt almost welcome. At least it was real. From the open kitchen window came Claudia's sharp voice again. "Hazel, that glass is still streaked. Do it properly." A small sound followed the fragile clink of glass, then a muffled sob. Graham froze, the thorn stem still in his hand. "Enough," he muttered, but the word never reached the window. He turned back toward the house, his jaw tight, his pulse loud in his ears. Later that evening, the house glowed with the amber of sunset. Claudia was on the phone, laughing, her laughter too loud, too rehearsed. Graham stood at the doorway, half listening to her boast about charity galas and neighbors' admiration. Upstairs, Hazel's laughter, the soft, real kind, was gone. He walked down the hall to her room. She was sitting by the window, holding a small picture frame. "Who's that, sweetheart?" he asked gently. "Mommy," she whispered, tracing the frame with her finger. "I keep it here, so she can see the stars with me." Graham's chest tightened. "That's beautiful, Hazel." She used to sing when we watered the roses," the girl said. "But Claudia says we shouldn't talk about her anymore. She says it makes everyone sad." He kneeled beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes being sad is how we remember the people we love." Her small eyes lifted to his, full of questions he wasn't brave enough to answer. Down the hall, Noah's toy car rolled under the door. The boy toddled in, his giggle quick and nervous, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to laugh. Graham smiled faintly. "Hey, champ. Big day driving, huh?" Noah grinned, showing a missing tooth, and for a heartbeat, Graham saw the light that used to fill this home. Then Claudia's heels clicked against the hardwood floor. "Bedtime," she announced, her tone final. The light faded. Graham kissed each forehead goodnight and stepped into the hall. The air felt colder there. He lingered a moment outside their door, listening to their whispered giggles fade into silence. Then he turned toward his study, the only place where he could breathe. On the desk lay an old photo, his late wife, smiling among the same roses that now drooped outside. The smile that had built this house. He picked up the phone and stared at it for a long while, thumb hovering over a familiar number. Outside, the wind rustled again through the garden, carrying a whisper that felt almost like her voice. He closed his eyes. Then, with a quiet exhale, he dialed. "Elliot Crane," answered a familiar voice on the line. "Graham? It's been a while." "Yeah," Graham said quietly, glancing at the dark window. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, the shadow of a man who'd built a fortune but lost the heart of his home. "I need to ask you something. Something unusual." Unusual is your specialty," Elliot said dryly. "Talk to me." Graham took a breath. "I think Claudia's been different with the kids. I don't have proof, but Hazel doesn't laugh anymore. And Noah, he hides behind her legs when I walk in the room." Elliot was silent for a moment, the only sound a faint clatter of his pen. "Are you sure it's not just grief talking?" "I know grief," Graham said, his voice low, steady. "This isn't it." He stared again at the photo on his desk, his wife's face frozen mid-laugh, eyes bright under the Carolina Sunday. "Something's off in that house. When I leave for work, I see the fear in Hazel's eyes. I need to know why." Elliot exhaled. "So what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Graham said slowly, "of taking a closer look, a way to see what happens when I'm not there." A pause, then a half-laugh on the other end. "Don't tell me you're planning to play detective." Closer than that," Graham replied. "A gardener." There was a long silence, followed by Elliot's incredulous snort. "You're out of your mind. That's not a plan. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." "It's my house," Graham said simply. "My children. If I'm wrong, I'll live with the shame. But if I'm right," he let the sentence hang, heavy as the night air. Elliot sighed. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. All right, if you're doing this, at least do it carefully. I'll cover your calls, make it look like you're out of state." "Thank you," Graham said. "Just promise me one thing," Elliot replied. "When you find whatever you're looking for, don't forget who you are." When the call ended, Graham stayed there, phone still in his hand. The lamp threw a soft circle of light across the desk, catching the edge of the photo frame. Outside, the roses swayed in the wind, their stems dark against the silver of the moon. He whispered into the quiet, "I'm sorry, love. I should have protected them better." He didn't sleep that night. The old house creaked as the wind pressed against its windows. Down the hall, he could hear the faint hum of Claudia's laughter through the walls, a sound that once felt charming but now seemed sharp enough to cut glass. He walked to the balcony, feeling the chill against his skin, and looked down at the garden. Tomorrow, he told himself, he'd start again, not as the man who built this mansion, but as someone forgotten, invisible, and free to see the truth. The next morning, just before dawn, the Whitfield estate was washed in mist. A single pickup truck rolled through the gate and parked by the servants' entrance. The engine went quiet. Inside the cab sat a man in a faded flannel shirt and old work boots, his hair tucked beneath a cap, his face hidden behind a rough beard. He looked down at his hands, soft once, now calloused by determination. For a moment he almost turned the key to leave, but then he saw, through the mist, a small figure in the window upstairs, Hazel, clutching her stuffed rabbit, peering out at the world below. She looked lost in a house that should have been her haven. Graham tightened his grip on the steering wheel, then opened the door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and pine. Each step toward the garden felt heavier than the last. The gravel crunched beneath his boots, the same path he once walked in polished shoes. He paused at the gate, taking in the sight of the house he had built, every brick, every window, a monument to love and ambition. Now it stood like a stranger. He whispered to himself, "Let's find out what really happens here." And somewhere deep inside, the garden seemed to stir as if the house itself knew that its silence was about to end. He picked up the shears and began to work, blending into the mist like a ghost returning home. He looked back once toward the upper window, where Hazel had vanished from sight. The sun was rising now, spilling gold across the Blue Ridge horizon. He spoke under his breath, to no one in particular, maybe to his late wife, maybe to the wind. "I'm coming, my little ones. I'm coming to bring you home." He turned away, trimmed the first branch, and the sound of snapping twigs echoed softly through the still morning air. He picked up the phone, dialing his lawyer's number. "Elliot," he said, his voice steady this time. "I need a favor. Something's not right at home." Downtown Asheville still slept beneath the soft gray dawn when Graham Whitfield parked his car in front of an old brick building that smelled faintly of coffee and rain. The golden letters on the glass door read Elliot Crane and Associates. Inside, a single light burned. His friend was already awake. Elliot Crane had always been the steady kind, the sort of man who ironed his shirts twice and drank the same black coffee every morning. When Graham stepped in, the small bell above the door chimed, startling the quiet. Elliot looked up from a stack of papers. "You really did it," he said, shaking his head. "I can't believe I'm about to help you pull this off." Graham smiled faintly. "You said you owed me one." "I meant for golf, not federal impersonation," Elliot replied dryly, pushing his glasses higher on his nose. "So tell me again, why not just hire someone? A private investigator? A nanny cam? Something normal?" "Because normal hasn't worked," Graham said, settling into the leather chair across from him. "I've spent years letting other people handle my life, assistants, nannies, tutors, lawyers. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing what was happening under my own roof. This time, I need to see it myself." Elliot studied him for a long moment. The man in front of him didn't look like the confident CEO who once filled magazines with his grin and charity headlines. This was someone older, quieter, stripped of armor. "Fine," Elliot said finally. "Let's assume this ridiculous plan of yours could actually work. What do you need from me?" "A cover," Graham answered. "Tell anyone who calls that I'm in New York for a month reviewing the new investment deal. You'll get calls from Claudia. She'll ask questions. Just tell her I'm too busy to talk." Elliot frowned. "And when she figures out you've gone missing from every meeting, every appearance?" "By then," Graham said, "I'll have the truth." The lawyer leaned back, sighing. "You really think she's capable of hurting them?" Graham looked down at his hands. They were clean, manicured hands made for contracts, not soil. "I don't know what she's capable of," he said softly. "But I know what fear looks like. Hazel's afraid of her own home." Elliot rubbed his temples. "You've always been stubborn, but this is something else." "Call it what you want," Graham replied. "A father's mistake needs more than apologies. It needs proof." They talked through the plan for another hour. Graham took notes of burner phone, a room at a local motel under a false name, a man named Javier Ruiz who would pretend to be him on occasional phone calls to Claudia. Every detail mattered. By the time he left, the sun had climbed higher, spilling golden light across the quiet streets. He stopped at a thrift store on the corner, where the bell jingled as he entered. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, smiled. "Looking for something special, sir?" "Something plain," he said. "Work clothes. For gardening. Got just the thing." She pulled a set of worn jeans and a flannel shirt from the rack, then added an old baseball cap. "You look like you could use a fresh start," she said kindly. He smiled, the first genuine one in days. "Maybe I could." An hour later, Graham stood before the mirror in the motel bathroom. The man staring back wasn't a billionaire anymore. His beard was rough, his hair hidden under the cap, his posture humbler somehow. The reflection felt honest, stripped of ego, of comfort, of everything except purpose. On the motel nightstand lay his phone, open to a message thread with Claudia. Her last text glowed coldly on the screen. "Don't worry about us, darling. Everything's under control." He turned off the phone and let the silence stretch. The faint hum of a highway filled the distance outside, the sound of a world moving on without him. He thought of Hazel's small voice, whispering, "Mommy says we shouldn't talk about her anymore." He pressed a hand against his chest, as if to hold something fragile there. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "tomorrow I'll know." The motel clock ticked toward noon. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere in the city, deep, slow, forgiving. Graham looked toward the window, where a thin line of sunlight cut through the blinds and painted the wall gold. He whispered into the stillness, "If you're watching, love, give me courage." Then he reached for the duffel bag on the bed and zipped it shut, sealing away the last traces of the man the world once knew. That evening, Graham walked the quiet streets of Asheville with his cap pulled low. The town felt different at night, slower, softer, the way it used to when he and his late wife would take drives after dinner just to listen to the cicadas hum in the dark. He stopped outside a diner glowing in warm orange light. Through the window, people laughed over pie and coffee, their voices weaving together like an old familiar song. He almost stepped inside. Almost. But he didn't belong among them, not tonight. Instead, he crossed the street and sat on a bench beneath the old oak tree that had shaded this square for generations. The bark was rough against his fingers as he traced a carving half hidden by moss, 2 initials, and a heart. Years faded. J+L, it read. He smiled. Someone else tried to make forever last, he murmured. A breeze stirred the fallen leaves, whispering through the streets like an echo of time. He could hear the faint laughter of children from a nearby playground, the kind of sound that once filled his home every morning. Now it was only a memory, distant as the stars that blinked above the Blue Ridge skyline. Back in his motel room, Graham laid out the tools he had bought that afternoon: pruning shears, gloves, a faded canvas apron. The smell of metal and fabric brought back the summer his wife taught Hazel to plant her first rosebush. He remembered how they'd knelt together in the dirt, her tiny hands covered in soil, her face lit with pride when the first bud opened. "Flowers grow better when you talk to them," his wife had said, smiling at him over the petals. "They listen if you're kind." Emberfor. He had laughed then, calling her sentimental. Now he wasn't sure she hadn't been right all along. The motel walls were thin. He could hear muffled laughter from the room next door. A young couple, carefree. He lay down and closed his eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. His thoughts wandered through the empty halls of his home, through the silence of the kitchen, through Hazel's frightened eyes. The question that had haunted him for weeks returned, whispering through his mind. When did fear replace love? He woke before dawn, the first light still hiding behind the mountains. The world outside was quiet, except for the hum of crickets and the far-off sound of a train. He dressed in his worn clothes, denim rough against his skin, boots stiff with newness, and washed his face in the motel sink. The man staring back at him in the mirror was a stranger, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. He picked up his duffel bag, heavy with tools, and stepped outside. The cold air smelled of dew and pine. His pickup waited in the lot, old and dented, borrowed from a rental yard that didn't ask questions. The engine coughed, then settled into a steady rumble. As he drove through the waking town, the sky began to change deep purple, giving way to soft pink over the ridges. The sun hadn't yet touched the rooftops, and the streets were nearly empty. He passed the church where the bell had rung yesterday, its steeple outlined against the dawn. For a brief moment, he felt something like peace. The winding road led him out of town and into the hills. Mist clung to the fields, wrapping the world in a pale silver veil. He knew every turn, every stretch of this road. He had driven it hundreds of times, back when the house at the end of it still felt like home. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as the iron gates of Whitfield Manor came into view. They loomed tall, black against the morning light, still engraved with his initials. For years they had symbolized success. Now they felt more like bars of a cage. He stopped the truck and let the engine idle. Through the mist, he could just make out the roofline of the mansion, the faint glimmer of its windows, catching the sunrise. He thought of Hazel's little face behind that glass, of Noah's quiet eyes watching everything and saying nothing. He breathed out slowly. The cold air stung his lungs, sharp and clean. Then he reached for the gate latch, the metal slick with dew. The hinges groaned softly as it opened. Gravel crunched under his boots as he drove through, each turn of the wheels carrying him closer to the truth he feared to find. The house stood silent, grand, and distant, the home of a man he no longer recognized. He parked by the servants' entrance, where the morning light barely reached. For a moment, he sat still, listening to the wind in the pines, to the faint hum of the world waking up. A single bird called from the garden, its song pure and fragile. Graham took a breath. "You built this place for love," he whispered. "Now let love save it." Ems. He climbed out of the truck, pulling the cap low over his eyes, and grabbed the shears from the passenger seat. The ground was wet beneath his boots. Every step felt like crossing into another life. At dawn, he parked his old pickup by the gate of his own mansion. The gardener had arrived. The first morning of his disguise began with the song of sparrows and the soft breath of fog weaving through the garden. The mist curled around the rose bushes like memory itself, delicate, half-faded, and full of things left unsaid. Graham Whitfield stood by the tool shed, gloved hands trembling slightly as he tried to look like he belonged among rakes and watering cans. The house looked different from this side. From the servants' path, the grand stone facade seemed colder, more distant. The windows were tall and shuttered, hiding the world within. A gardener was expected to be invisible, and for the first time in his life, Graham found comfort in that. He bent down to tie his boot when he heard a voice behind him, soft, carrying the accent of someone who'd learned English through patience, not privilege. "You're the new one," she said. "The lady told me someone would help with the garden this week." Graham straightened and turned. The woman standing there wore a faded blue work dress and held a wicker basket full of cleaning cloths. She was in her early 30s, with warm brown skin and dark hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes, deep and kind, studied him for only a second before offering a small smile. "I'm Elena Morales," she said. "Housekeeping." Her voice was quiet but steady, like someone used to not being listened to. "Tom," Graham replied, remembering the name on his forged papers. "Tom Baker. I'll be outside mostly." "Good," she said, a hint of humor in her tone. "Less chance the lady finds something to correct." She gave him a knowing look before walking past, her steps light, her shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying too much that wasn't hers. He watched her disappear through the back door, the faint scent of lemon soap trailing behind her. Something about her presence softened the morning. Hours passed. Graham pruned the roses, swept the paths, trimmed the hedge. Each motion grounded him in silence, the kind of quiet he hadn't felt since before the company boardrooms and charity banquets. When the sun rose higher, Elena reappeared, carrying 2 mason jars of lemonade. "You've been at it since sunrise," she said, offering him one. "Drink before you fall over." He smiled faintly. "You always bring lemonade to strangers?" "Only to the ones who look like they need a friend." They sat by the old fountain, its waterline green with time. The garden was still, except for the hum of bees and the distant voice of Claudia calling someone from the balcony. Elena didn't flinch, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "She doesn't like the help resting," Elena murmured. "I'll keep that in mind," Graham said quietly. Elena studied him again. "You're not from here," she said. "Your hands, they don't look like a man who works the ground for a living." He glanced down, even through the gloves. She wasn't wrong. "Guess I'm learning," he said. She smiled gently. "It'll come to you. Gardens are patient, with good hearts." That line hung between them, simple and profound. It reminded him of his late wife, her gentle faith in small things. He almost said something, almost told her that once upon a time this garden was filled with music and laughter. But he stopped himself. For now, he was just Tom, the gardener. Later that afternoon, he saw Hazel from a distance, standing by her window, her small hands pressed to the glass, her eyes fixed on the roses below. When she noticed him looking, she smiled shyly and waved. Graham froze, then lifted his hand in return. It lasted only a heartbeat before Claudia appeared behind the curtain, pulling the girl away. The window went dark. The air turned heavy. Graham's throat tightened with anger he couldn't show. He turned back to the soil, gripping the trowel until his knuckles whitened. Elena came up beside him again, setting down a basket of laundry. "Don't mind what happens inside," she said softly. "Sometimes the walls have more ears than hearts." He looked at her, surprised. She didn't know who he was, but somehow she understood. "How long have you been here, Elena?" 2 years, she said. "Long enough to see that not all rich houses are happy ones." He nodded slowly. "You ever think of leaving?" She shrugged. "Where would I go? My boy's in community college." "The lady pays on time. I say my prayers and hope for peace." Her honesty touched him, a quiet courage in every word. "Your boy's lucky to have you," he said. She smiled at that, her eyes softening. "Maybe, but it's hard raising someone good in a world that rewards the loud." They worked side by side for a while, the silence between them no longer empty, but peaceful. A fragile trust had begun to take root. When the sun dipped low, painting the garden in gold, Elena gathered her things. "See you tomorrow, Tom," she said. He nodded. Tomorrow. After she left, Graham lingered by the roses. The air smelled of lemon, soap, and earth, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something stir, a small, forgotten warmth. Maybe redemption didn't begin with grand gestures, he thought. Maybe it started with kindness, quiet and steady, like the woman who'd brought him lemonade. He turned toward the house, the windows reflecting the last light of day. From inside came the faint echo of Claudia's voice, sharp, commanding. He listened, not as a husband or a businessman, but as a man determined to see. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what he might find. The next morning came quietly, carried by a cool wind that smelled of pine and damp earth. Graham was already in the garden before sunrise, trimming the rose bushes beneath the pale light. The house behind him was still asleep, but even in that silence, he could sense tension hiding inside those walls, like a storm gathering behind a closed door. By 7 o'clock, the mansion stirred. Claudia's heels clicked across the kitchen floor, followed by the sharp tone of her voice cutting through the air. "Hazel, don't dawdle. We're not raising slackers here." Graham's hand froze mid-cut. He could hear the girl's quiet apology, thin as wind through glass. He turned toward the house, but before he could move, Elena stepped out onto the back porch, her arms full of linens. She caught his eye briefly, a silent warning, then slipped through the doorway. Inside, the sound of Claudia's scolding grew louder. Then came a soft thud, not violent, but enough to make Graham's heart clench. He dropped the shears and started toward the door. Elena appeared first. She stood in the doorway, blocking the view inside, her face calm but pale. "It's fine," she whispered, almost pleading. "Let me handle this." Graham stopped a few feet away, forcing himself to breathe. "Is she all right?" Elena nodded quickly. "Just a broken plate." The girl's frightened, not hurt. She lowered her voice even more. "Please, don't draw attention. The lady doesn't like people watching." Her words carried a quiet bravery. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, but her gaze stayed steady. She turned back inside before he could speak, closing the door softly behind her. For the rest of the morning, the air around the house felt heavier. Graham worked near the back window, pretending to sweep the path while listening. Through the thin glass, he could hear the sound of Elena's voice, gentle, soothing, telling Hazel a story about a rose that learned to bloom again after a storm. The story was simple, but every word carried the weight of kindness. The girl's sobs faded into quiet sniffles, and by the time the tale ended, Graham heard her small giggle. It was faint, but it was laughter. He closed his eyes for a moment. Something inside him, something buried beneath years of guilt and silence, began to thaw. When Elena stepped outside later, she looked tired but calm. Her sleeves were rolled up, and a streak of flour clung to her cheek. Graham offered her a small smile. "You're good with them," he said. She shrugged, setting the laundry basket on the step. "I just remember what fear feels like." He studied her face, the quiet strength, the weariness carried with grace. "And what does it take to stop being afraid?" he asked softly. She thought for a moment. "Someone has to show you they're not." Her answer lingered in the air between them, like the warmth of sunlight breaking through clouds. They worked side by side again that afternoon, tending the garden in companionable silence. Elena hummed an old song under her breath, a tune that sounded like a lullaby carried from far away. Graham didn't recognize the words, but the melody filled the space around them, gentle and steady. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement at the upstairs window. Hazel again, peeking down, her small hand waving shyly. Elena noticed too, and waved back with a smile so soft it could melt stone. "She's sweet," Elena said. "You can tell she's got a kind heart." Graham's throat tightened. "She gets that from her mother." Elena tilted her head. "You know them well?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I used to," he said finally. She didn't press further. "Then maybe that's enough to care." As the sun began to set, the house glowed with orange light. Claudia's voice echoed faintly from the balcony, sharp as ever, giving orders to no one in particular. But for a little while, down in the garden, the world felt peaceful. Just the sound of pruning shears, soft humming, and the scent of earth after rain. When Elena left for the day, Graham lingered among the roses. He found one bush that Hazel had once planted with her mother. He could still remember the spot. He knelt and brushed away the weeds, careful not to disturb the roots. Beneath the tangled vines, a single green bud pushed through the soil, small but determined. He smiled faintly. "You made it," he whispered. From the upstairs window came a soft flicker of light Hazel's night lamp. shaped like a star. He looked up, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller. The garden was quiet except for the whisper of wind through the trees. He picked up the shears, his shadow long against the grass, and turned toward the house. In that fading light, one truth settled in his heart. Sometimes the smallest acts, a smile, a kind word, a story told at the right moment, could grow roots deep enough to change a life. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that Elena Morales had just planted the first seed of his redemption. The next few days unfolded with a quiet rhythm, the kind that makes you forget danger might be growing beneath it. Morning light spilled over the hills, painting Whitfield Manor in gold. But inside those walls, the air stayed cold. Graham, still in his disguise, had learned to move through the garden like a shadow. The staff had grown used to him, a quiet man who kept his head down and his hands busy, yet his eyes never stopped watching. From his post near the roses, he could see the world behind the glass. Claudia floated from room to room like a queen ruling a kingdom of silence. Every sound in that house bent around her. Even laughter seemed to die before reaching the walls. On Tuesday morning, as he trimmed the hedges by the kitchen, Graham heard Hazel's small voice. "I drew this for Mommy," she said. There was a pause, then Claudia's sharp reply. "That's not your mother, Hazel. Don't start with that again." The air inside the house shifted. Graham froze, his heart sinking. He couldn't see, but he could imagine Hazel's little face, confusion clouding her eyes. "It's just a picture," the girl said softly. He heard paper tear the sound of innocence being ripped apart. "Throw it away," Claudia said. "You'll learn to behave properly if you want to make your father proud." Hazel didn't answer. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. Through the reflection in the glass, Graham caught a glimpse of movement, a small shadow darting down the hall, a woman's figure following. Elena. He set down the hedge trimmers and moved closer, pretending to collect fallen leaves. Inside, near the bottom of the stairs, Hazel sat curled on the floor, her drawing in pieces beside her. Claudia had gone. Elena knelt quietly, gathering the torn bits and placing them on her lap. "Don't cry, mi cielo," she whispered. "Even if she tears it, your love still stays whole." Hazel sniffled, watching as Elena smoothed the paper with gentle hands. "Why doesn't she like me?" the little girl asked. Elena hesitated. "Some people forget what love looks like when they stop using it." Graham's throat tightened. He turned away, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. He wanted to rush inside, to pull Hazel into his arms and tell her none of this was her fault, but he couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he reached into his pocket and felt the small recorder hidden there. It was time to start collecting proof. That evening, he placed the device near the open window of the kitchen while sweeping the back path. He could hear Claudia talking on the phone, her tone smooth and distant. "They're finally behaving," she said with a light laugh. "Fear works better than kindness. Children respect discipline." The words cut through him like ice. He left the recorder running until she hung up. Later, in his motel room, he listened again and again to that cold voice, each repetition hardening his resolve. He opened his notebook, a simple thing, bound in leather, and wrote, "Day 7. Hazel's picture torn, Claudia's words recorded, Elena protecting them quietly. Tomorrow, I confront the truth." He closed the book and sat in the dim light, the ticking of the old motel clock echoing in the silence. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly over the mountains. Rain was coming. He looked toward the dark window and whispered, "Hold on, Hazel. Hold on, sweetheart." When dawn arrived, the storm broke a heavy Carolina rain, steady and relentless. Graham pulled on his coat and drove through the gray streets toward the mansion. When he reached the gate, he saw Elena standing on the porch, a broom in hand, her hair damp, her expression weary but calm. She waved him over. "Morning, Tom," she said with a faint smile. "You'll need more than a hat today." "I've weathered worse," he replied, returning the smile. "The lady's in one of her moods," Elena warned softly. "Stay outside if you can." He nodded, but deep down, he knew the rain wasn't the only storm waiting that day. The storm rolled in just after noon, gray clouds pressing low over the Blue Ridge Hills. Rain lashed the windows, blurring the garden into a watercolor of green and silver. Inside, the mansion echoed with sharp voices. Graham stood beneath the oak tree, pruning shears forgotten in his hand. Through the kitchen window, he could see Claudia pacing, her phone in one hand. Irritation etched across her perfect face. Elena stood near the counter, wringing out a towel, quiet but watchful. "Where's the nanny?" Claudia snapped. "It's lunchtime, and those children aren't even dressed." "She's homesick, ma'am," Elena said softly. "I can take care of them today." "You?" Claudia turned, eyes narrowing. "You can barely manage the laundry, and you think you can handle my stepchildren?" Elena's chin lifted slightly. "They just need a little kindness, ma'am." "Kindness?" Claudia's laugh was cold. "What they need is discipline. That's what their father expects." Graham felt his pulse quicken. He could hear every word through the rain. Claudia poured herself a glass of wine, though it was barely past noon. "That girl is spoiled," she said. "Always drawing, always daydreaming. I've half a mind to send her to boarding school where someone can teach her manners." Elena's voice trembled, but she stood her ground. "She's only a child, Mrs. Whitfield." Claudia turned, wine sloshing against the rim of her glass. "Don't you dare tell me how to raise her. You're the help. Nothing more." The words hung in the air like thunder. Graham's hands clenched at his sides. Hazel entered the kitchen then, her small arms wrapped around a stuffed bunny, the one her mother had given her before she passed. The sight of it must have ignited something cruel in Claudia's heart. "What did I say about that filthy thing?" she barked. Hazel froze. "I just wanted to keep it with me." "Throw it away!" Claudia snatched the toy from her hands and tossed it into the trash. "You're not a baby anymore." Tears welled in the girl's eyes. She reached toward the trash can, but Claudia's glare stopped her cold. "Please, ma'am," Elena said, gently stepping forward. "I can wash it. It's clean after that." Claudia whirled on her. "Did I ask for your opinion?" "No, ma'am." "But then stay out of it." The slap of her words was louder than the storm. Hazel's lip trembled. Elena stood still, her face pale but her eyes steady. Then she knelt beside Hazel and whispered something so soft even the rain couldn't drown it out. Whatever it was made the child's crying slow. Watching from the garden, Graham felt his heart break open. He pressed one palm against the cold glass, his breath fogging the window. "That's enough," he thought. "I can't watch this anymore." But Elena's courage stopped him. She took Hazel's hand and said quietly, "Go upstairs, sweetheart. I'll bring your toy soon." Claudia's gaze followed the girl out of the room. "You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot," she muttered. Elena didn't answer. She picked the stuffed bunny out of the trash, brushed it off, and cradled it against her chest. "No one should lose the things that make them feel safe," she said softly. Claudia's eyes flashed, but she didn't reply. She turned and stormed out, her heels striking the tile like thunderclaps. When the door slammed shut, Graham exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. He wiped the rain from his face, unsure if it was water or tears. Moments later, Elena stepped out the back door, holding the little bunny carefully wrapped in a towel. She jumped when she saw him standing there. "Tom, you scared me," she said, clutching the bundle tighter. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean to." His voice shook slightly. "You shouldn't have to deal with that alone." Elena forced a small smile. "Some people don't change. You just have to protect what you can." He looked at the toy in her hands. "That girl, she means something to you." "She reminds me of my son when he was small," Elena said. "Brave, even when the world's too big." Thunder cracked above them. She shivered, and without thinking, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She hesitated, then nodded her thanks. "I'll take this back to her," she said, glancing toward the upstairs window where Hazel's curtain fluttered faintly. "Sometimes love is just doing the small things no one else notices." Graham watched her disappear inside, the storm softening to a gentle rain. He turned back to the roses, the shears heavy in his hand, and whispered, "You're right, Elena. Small things. That's where love begins." The rain eased, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and forgiveness waiting to bloom. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to the house like the scent of wet stone. The next morning, the mountains stood wrapped in fog, and the garden glistened beneath a thin veil of dew. From the outside, Whitfield Manor looked calm again, but Graham knew better. Peace had never truly lived within those walls, only the illusion of it. He parked the truck quietly at the back gate, the old hinges groaning like they, too, wanted to rest. Today felt different. The air was sharp, expectant. He tightened his cap, slipped the small recorder into his shirt pocket, and stepped into the garden. Elena was already there, hanging linens on the line strung between two maple trees. The morning light painted her face soft gold. "You're early," she said with a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep," Graham admitted. "Storm kept me thinking." "Storms do that," she said. "They make you hear what you've been ignoring." They worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt like understanding. Then, from the kitchen window, came Claudia's voice, shrill, commanding, like the crack of a whip. "Hazel, come here this instant." Graham stiffened. Elena froze mid-motion, her hands gripping the wet sheet. A moment later, the girl appeared at the window, small and pale, clutching the same stuffed bunny that had been rescued the day before. Claudia snatched it from her again. "You still have this? Didn't I tell you?" The rest of the words were lost behind the glass, but the tone was unmistakable. Graham's jaw tightened. He turned the recorder on, the red light blinking faintly beneath his pocket flap. Elena glanced at him, her eyes full of silent warning. "Be careful," she mouthed. "I'm done watching," he whispered back. A few minutes later, Claudia stormed out the back door, heels striking the wet stone, her anger spilling into the air. "I don't pay you people to meddle in my business," she snapped at Elena. "You're here to clean, not to teach my stepdaughter how to defy me." Elena stood her ground. "No one's teaching her to defy you, ma'am. I'm just teaching her kindness." Claudia's eyes narrowed. "Kindness doesn't raise respectable children. Fear does." Those words, cold, familiar, struck something deep in Graham. He remembered hearing them once before, years ago, from his own father's lips. It had shaped him, hardened him, and cost him nearly everything. Now it echoed in this house, like a curse passed down through generations. Claudia turned sharply toward the garden, glaring at Graham. "And you, why are you standing there? Those hedges are uneven." He lowered his eyes. "Yes, ma'am." She lingered for a moment, as if daring him to look up. When he didn't, she turned back to Elena. "One more act of insolence from you, and you can find another house to work in." "Oh." Elena didn't flinch. "Understood, Mom." Claudia swept back inside, the door slamming behind her. For a moment, the only sound was the dripping of rainwater from the eaves. Then Elena exhaled, long and heavy. "She'll ruin herself with that anger," she murmured. Graham looked at her. "And maybe she's already halfway there." Elena gave him a weary smile. "I've worked for people like her all my life. They think cruelty makes them strong, but it only makes them alone." He nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "How do you keep your peace in a house like this?" "I pray," she said simply. "Not for miracles, just for strength to stay kind." The wind picked up, stirring the wet leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 10 times. Graham felt the sound settle in his chest, deep, steady, and solemn. He knew then that Elena wasn't just protecting Hazel. She was protecting what little goodness remained in this house. And without realizing it, she was teaching him how to do the same. As the day stretched on, Graham trimmed the hedges near the dining room, close enough to overhear but far enough to remain invisible. Claudia had guessed that afternoon 3 women whose laughter never reached their eyes. He could hear their conversation drift through the open windows. "Your stepchildren are so quiet," one said. "Yes," Claudia replied proudly. "I've taught them to behave." Discipline works wonders when love fails. The women murmured approval, sipping from their glasses. Graham's hand tightened on the hedge trimmer. He could feel the recorder's weight in his pocket, capturing every word. It wasn't just evidence anymore, it was truth preserved. Proof that fear had taken root in the place where love once bloomed. As the guests laughed, Hazel's small face appeared again in the upstairs window. She wasn't waving this time. She was watching, wide-eyed, silent, a child trying to understand how love could hurt so much. Graham looked up at her and whispered, "Not much longer, sweetheart. Not much longer." The wind carried his words away, but somehow, he hoped she heard them. That evening, the house was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. The guests had gone, the laughter had faded, and only the soft hum of the rain gutters remained. Graham worked near the porch, pretending to sweep. Inside, he could hear Claudia's voice again, sharper now, strained. "Elena, you think I don't see what you're doing?" I'm only trying to help, Elena said. Help? Claudia's tone rose. You're turning my stepchildren against me. Don't mistake kindness for permission. There was the faint sound of glass shattering, then a small cry. Hazel's voice frightened, pleading. Graham froze. He dropped the broom and moved closer to the door, heart pounding. Through the narrow opening, he saw Elena shielding the little girl with her arms, her face pale but fierce. She's a child, Elena said quietly. Enough. For a heartbeat, even Claudia hesitated. Then she turned and stormed away, her heels striking like thunder across the tile. The moment she was gone, Graham stepped inside just long enough to whisper, "Are you all right?" Elena nodded, still holding Hazel close. "She's scared," she murmured, "but safe." Graham looked at them, the maid who stood up for what was right, and the child who had forgotten how to smile, and something inside him finally broke. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. That night, back in his motel room, he played the recording Claudia's words about fear, the sound of Hazel's cry. The proof he needed was there, but so was something more. The echo of Elena's courage. He whispered to the darkness, "Tomorrow, it ends." Outside, the rain stopped, and somewhere over the mountains, the first stars began to appear. The dawn broke soft and pale over the Blue Ridge Mountains, a faint mist curling above the trees like breath from the earth itself. Graham hadn't slept. The small recorder sat on the table beside him, its red light blinking in the dark, a witness to everything that had gone wrong in the house he once called home. He poured himself a cup of motel coffee, thin, bitter, the kind that tasted of long nights and heavy choices. He took one sip, then reached for his phone. "Daniel," he said when his lawyer's voice came through, groggy with sleep. "I need you at the house this weekend. Bring the papers." "You're ready?" Daniel asked. "I've been ready for too long," Graham replied. By the time he arrived at Whitfield Manor, the morning sun had burned through the mist. The mansion gleamed as if nothing inside it could possibly be broken. But Graham knew better. He parked near the back gate, his heart steady, his hands sure. Elena was already in the garden, kneeling by the roses. When she saw him, she smiled faintly. "You look different today," she said. "Maybe I finally remembered who I am," he answered. Something in his tone made her pause. "You're planning something, aren't you?" He didn't deny it. "Claudia's guests are coming again today. She wants to show off how perfect everything is. It's time they see the truth." Elena's eyes widened. "You can't just—" "I can," he interrupted gently. "And I have to. For them." He nodded toward the upstairs window, where Hazel's curtain fluttered softly. Elena lowered her gaze. "Then let me help." "You already have," he said quietly. "More than you know." The day moved slowly. Claudia spent the morning arranging flowers in the dining hall, her voice echoing through the marble corridors as she barked orders. "Polish the silver again, Elena. I want this place spotless." "Yes, ma'am," Elena answered calmly, her hands steady even as her heart raced. From outside, Graham tended the roses, or at least pretended to. The recorder was tucked safely in his pocket. Each sound, each cruel word, each moment of false perfection, he captured them all. At noon, 3 women arrived, their laughter drifting through the front gate like perfume. They carried small boxes of pastries and the easy arrogance of people who had never had to work for kindness. "Oh, Claudia, this place looks divine," one of them exclaimed. "Thank you," Claudia said with a smile so polished it could cut glass. "Wait until you see the children. They've learned to behave beautifully." The words twisted something deep inside Graham. He looked at Elena, who was setting the last of the dishes. Her eyes met his briefly, a silent signal. "Stay calm. Not yet." When the guests moved toward the terrace, Claudia called up the stairs. "Hazel! Noah! Come greet our friends." Graham's breath caught. This was it, the moment she'd put her cruelty on display under the mask of motherhood. A few seconds later, Hazel appeared at the top of the stairs, holding her little brother's hand. She looked beautiful and heartbreakingly fragile in a pale blue dress, her eyes dull with exhaustion. Claudia beamed. "Smile, darling," she said through gritted teeth. "Show them how happy you are." Hazel forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The women cooed, calling her adorable, well-behaved, a perfect little angel. Elena stood by the wall, silent, her hands trembling. She couldn't watch this charade much longer. Graham took one step closer to the door, his pulse pounding in his ears. Not yet, he told himself. Wait for the right moment. And then it happened. Hazel reached for a glass of water. Her hand slipped. The glass fell, shattering across the floor. The sound silenced the room. Claudia's face turned crimson. "Look what you've done!" she hissed. "I'm sorry," Hazel whispered, tears brimming. Claudia raised her hand not to strike, but close enough that everyone froze, and before Graham could move, Elena stepped forward. "Stop," she said firmly. "She's just a child." The room fell silent. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. Claudia's hand hovered midair, her expression shifting from fury to disbelief. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Elena said, her voice shaking but clear. "No one here deserves your anger." The guests stared, mouths half open. Hazel clung to Elena's skirt, trembling. From outside the terrace door, Graham watched, and he knew the moment had come. The room froze. For a long heartbeat, no one spoke. Elena stood between Claudia and the child, her breath quick, but her eyes steady. Claudia's voice trembled with fury. "You forget your place." "My place," Elena said softly, "is wherever kindness is needed." The guests looked at each other, uneasy. Hazel hid behind Elena's skirt, tears slipping silently down her face. Outside the terrace door, Graham took one step forward, the decision already made. He pushed the door open, the sound cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough," he said. Claudia turned, furious. "You stay out of this!" He met her glare calmly, then reached up and peeled off the fake beard. The room gasped. "Graham?" one of the guests whispered. Claudia went pale. "No, no. You were supposed to be in New York," he said quietly. "I was here. Watching, listening." "Oh?" He pulled the recorder from his pocket and pressed play. Claudia's own voice filled the room, cold, cruel, undeniable. "Fear works better than kindness." Silence. The truth echoed louder than any shout could. Hazel ran into his arms, crying. He held her tight, his voice breaking. "It's over, sweetheart. No one will hurt you again." Claudia tried to speak, but her words failed her. The mask had fallen. The guests looked away, embarrassed by the ugliness they had praised moments before. Graham turned to Elena. Their eyes met, gratitude, sorrow, and quiet strength passing between them. "You saved them," he said. "No," she whispered. "You finally saw them." Outside, the storm clouds began to break, sunlight spilling through like forgiveness itself. The silence that followed was unlike any before, deep, heavy, yet somehow peaceful. Claudia stood frozen near the window, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger she no longer recognized. The women who had come to praise her perfection were now silent, their faces pale. One of them reached for her purse, whispering something about needing to leave. Another avoided her eyes completely. Graham held Hazel close, her tears soaking his shirt. Noah clung to his leg, small hands trembling but safe. For a moment, no one moved, as if the house itself needed time to understand what had just happened. Finally, Claudia found her voice. You planned this," she said hoarsely. "You humiliated me in my own home. This house stopped being yours the day you made it a place of fear," Graham replied quietly. His voice wasn't angry, only tired, like a man who had finally laid down a heavy burden. Claudia's jaw tightened. "You'll regret this." "No," he said softly. "I regret waiting this long." Daniel, his lawyer, appeared at the terrace door moments later, papers in hand. "It's done," he said simply. Claudia looked between them, disbelief spreading across her face. "You had this ready?" Graham nodded. "Divorce papers, custody, everything. You'll have what's fair, but you won't have them." She laughed bitterly. "You think you can just erase me?" He met her gaze with quiet resolve. "You erased yourself." The words landed like truth always does not loud, but impossible to ignore. Claudia's eyes filled with tears, though whether they came from anger or shame, no one could tell. She turned sharply, gathering her coat and leaving without another word. The sound of her heels faded down the hall. Then the front door closed with a final, hollow thud. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the ticking of the old clock filled the room. Then Hazel's small voice broke the silence. "Daddy, is she gone?" Graham knelt to meet her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," he said gently. "She's gone, and she's not coming back." Hazel's lip quivered, but then she nodded, pressing her forehead against his. "Can Elena stay?" He looked toward the maid, the woman who had protected his children when he couldn't. Elena stood near the doorway, uncertain, her hands clasped tightly together. "If she wants to," he said. Elena smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Only if I'm welcome." Hazel ran to her, wrapping small arms around her waist. "You always are." The moment was small, quiet, but it felt like the first true breath of peace this house had taken in years. Outside, the garden glowed beneath a clearing sky. The rain had washed away the dust and anger, leaving everything new and trembling with light. Graham looked around the room. The same walls that had once echoed with fear now felt different, softer somehow. Maybe it wasn't the house that needed changing. Maybe it was him. He turned to Elena. "Thank you," he said simply. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "You just needed to see." That evening, the house felt different, quieter, lighter, as if it had finally exhaled. The rain had stopped, and the last rays of sunlight stretched across the garden, touching everything with gold. Graham stood by the roses, no longer in disguise, just himself. Elena stepped out with 2 glasses of lemonade. "The children are asleep," she said softly. "Hazel's holding her little bunny again." He smiled. "She used to fall asleep like that every night. I'd forgotten how peaceful she looked." They sat under the old oak tree. The air smelled of rain and forgiveness. For a long time, neither spoke. "I failed them," Graham said finally. "I thought success could replace presence." Elena shook her head. "You didn't fail. You found your way back. That's what love does. It keeps trying." Her words settled into the quiet like a blessing. The roses swayed gently, their petals shining with dew. Graham looked toward the house, warm light spilling from the windows. "Maybe it's time to stop mourning and start living again," he murmured. Elena smiled. "Then start now," he nodded. "Tomorrow, we begin again." She met his eyes. "Together." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that felt like forgiveness itself. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, warming the floor where Hazel and Noah sat drawing with crayons. Their laughter, light, unguarded, real, filled the house for the first time in what felt like years. Graham stood by the counter, watching them with quiet wonder. The sound was simple, ordinary, but to him, it was sacred. "You too hungry?" he asked, his voice rough with warmth. Hazel nodded. "Can we have pancakes?" "Pancakes it is," he said, smiling. Elena appeared, tying her apron, hair pulled into a loose braid. "I'll help." "You've done enough," he said gently. "Let me do this." She leaned against the counter, amused. "You? Cook?" "I can learn," he said, flipping through a recipe book that had belonged to his late wife. The pages were yellowed and spotted with flour, little traces of a life he once thought was gone for good. As he whisked the batter, Hazel climbed onto a stool beside him. "Mom used to hum when she cooked," she said. Graham paused, then began to hum softly, off-key but familiar. Hazel grinned. "That's it," she said. Elena turned away, blinking back a smile. "You've got yourself a good teacher," she said. Outside, the garden shimmered in the sunlight, the roses blooming brighter than ever. The air smelled of earth and lemon soap, the fragrance of a new beginning. After breakfast, they stepped outside together. The children ran to the fountain, splashing their hands in the water. Graham and Elena followed, slower, savoring the quiet beauty of the morning. He looked around the same garden where he had once hidden in shame and fear, now alive again. "I used to think this place was just walls and money," he said softly. "Now I see. It was never the house that needed saving." Elena smiled gently. "Homes aren't built with stone, Mr. Whitfield. They're built with people." He nodded, eyes following Hazel as she showed her brother how to blow on a dandelion. The seeds lifted into the air, carried off by the breeze, tiny white wishes drifting toward the mountains. Graham reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recorder. He turned it over once, then pressed the button and watched the red light go out. "No more recording," he said. "No more pretending. Just life." Elena looked at him, her expression soft. "You've earned that." For a long moment, they stood in silence, listening to the children's laughter mixing with birdsong. The world felt simple again, not perfect, but real. That evening, the town square of Asheville came alive with music. The Harvest Festival lights twinkled between the old oaks, and the air smelled of cinnamon, hay, and roasted corn. Families gathered, laughter weaving through the sound of fiddles and wind. Graham walked hand in hand with Hazel and Noah, Elena beside them carrying a basket of cookies she'd baked that morning. They looked, for the first time, like what they were always meant to be, a family. At the edge of the square, a small choir began to sing "Amazing Grace." Hazel tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, Mom used to love this song." He smiled gently. "I know, sweetheart. She still does." Elena looked up at him, her eyes shining in the glow of lanterns. "She'd be proud," she whispered. He nodded. "Maybe we all found grace tonight." The music rose, slow and steady. Filling the evening air, Graham took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past lift at last. He looked at Elena, at the children, at the lights reflecting off the river, and thought maybe redemption didn't come with grand gestures, but with quiet moments like this. A hand held, a laugh shared, a heart finally at peace. The night wind carried laughter through the town, and the stars above the Blue Ridge shone like blessings. The garden lay quiet again beneath the Blue Ridge twilight, a soft reminder that even after storms, life finds its way back to peace. The laughter of children drifted from the porch, blending with the hum of crickets and the distant toll of the evening bell. Graham stood beneath the old oak tree, the same one that had once witnessed his silence, now watching his family gathered around a table lit by warm yellow light. Elena's voice, gentle and steady, carried through the air like a hymn. He had lost everything that once defined him: wealth, pride, control. Yet in that loss, he had rediscovered the only thing that truly mattered: love that asks for nothing, forgiveness that expects nothing. His home, once cold and hollow, now breathed again with laughter, with hope, with belonging. Perhaps that's the quiet secret of life, that redemption doesn't come in grand moments, but in the small, unseen choices. Staying, listening, saying, "I'm sorry." It's in the morning coffee shared with someone who stayed when the world didn't. It's in a simple dinner around the kitchen table where no one talks about success, only about how the roses are finally blooming again. Like the porch light that stays on long after everyone's gone to bed, kindness doesn't need to be loud to change a life. It just needs to shine steadily through the dark. The lesson of this story is simple but eternal. Love and redemption build the truest home. Kindness, freely given, has the power to rewrite even the saddest chapters of our lives. Everyone deserves a place to belong, and sometimes all it takes is one act of compassion to remind us who we really are. So tonight, as you finish this story, take a moment to think of your own, the people who stayed beside you, the chances you gave, or maybe the ones you still can. Life, after all, is generous with second chances. If this story touched your heart, type 1 in the comments below. If not, or if you have thoughts to share, type 0. Your voice matters here. And if the warmth of this tale found a small corner in your memory, subscribe and stay with us for more stories that heal, forgive, and remind us of the beauty of being human.